Buenas tardes. Se declara.
Good afternoon. I call to order the 12th meeting of the United Nations to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading toward their total elimination.
Les agradecemos a los participantes tomar sus respectivos.
I would ask delegates to please take their seats so that we can begin our deliberations.
La conferencia continuará ahora.
The conference will now continue its examination of item 9 of the program of work. The read-through of the preamble. And I'd like to remind delegations that when you take the floor, please press the button on your microphone to request the microphone. And I'd also like to begin by thanking all delegation for their understanding this morning in our meeting. And I'd like to begin by I'd like to ask those at the back of the room to please take your seats, and that will help us to keep the noise down in the room. Thank you. So I was saying that I wanted to thank all delegations for your understanding this morning. And I'd like to remind you of some procedural aspects that we have to bear in mind. Some delegations put some questions towards the end of the morning meeting, and we'd like to recall that in this review process, where we're going paragraph by paragraph through the text, when we open up a new section, the President is going to first explain the content of the section, and immediately after that we'll go paragraph by paragraph through the section. And of course, delegations will be able to make their initial interventions pertinent to that section. Their general interventions, and also the specific interventions relating to the paragraph under consideration. We've also asked that delegations that have particular requests for new paragraphs to introduce those towards the end of our consideration of the relevant section. So when I say that, I mean it's when we've considered the final paragraph of that section. And then the paragraphs that are going to be proposed will be directly related to the paragraph under consideration. I'd also like to recall that as we gather all of the comments being made, we're also working with our team to try to include the proposals and adjustments being made. I think this morning there was a great wealth of proposals and observations that were made. I think that there's a lot of convergence in what we see. Now, it's true, some delegations did point out some areas of complexity in adapting the text, but that notwithstanding, I think there is a large degree of convergence. So I'd like to resume now our consideration of the preamble, beginning with preambular paragraph 2. And after making the introduction in my mother tongue, I'll move into English in order to follow the English text that we have before us.
Start reading the second preambular paragraph, which mentions that cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons transcends national borders, poses grave implications for human survival, the environment, socioeconomic development, the global economy, food security, and for the health of future generations, and of the disproportionate impact of ionizing radiation on material health and on girls. This paragraph reflects the calls made for the Convention to recognize the findings of the International Conference on the Humanitarian Impact of Nuclear Weapons. The elements in this paragraph draw from the preamble of resolutions 71/46 and 70/47 on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. In addition, it reflects the calls from the March session for the Convention to recognize, in particular, the gendered impact of nuclear weapons. On this point, and before I open the floor for comment, I wish to acknowledge that upon further reflection and receiving feedback from different delegations, the term maternal health does not fully capture current scientific understanding of the gendered impact of nuclear weapons. We therefore propose that we can consider the phrase maternal health and on girls to be replaced with the phrase the health of women and girls. The end of the paragraph then would read as follows: and the disproportionate impact of ionizing radiation on the health of women and girls. Before opening the floor, I also wish to invite delegations to consider in their statements and comments the overall preamble and the overall content of the preamble, as some suggestions that are made for one specific paragraph sometimes are referred or are captured in following paragraphs, as was rightly noticed by some delegations in the morning. So I would like to invite all of you to make your comments on each of the paragraphs, but bearing in mind the whole document that we are analyzing. Let me now give the floor to the delegations wishing to comment on preambular paragraph 2. I see the delegation of Marshall Islands, followed by Ireland and Sweden.
President, for giving me the floor. Madam Chair, distinguished delegates, and friends, the Republic of the Marshall Islands recognizes the incredible progress which was achieved during the first round of negotiations. We further welcome the draft convention. Regarding the preamble, it introduces and sets out the vision of this treaty. It provides us with the directions to move forward towards the global goal of a world without nuclear weapons. In relation to our strong conviction about the significance of the preamble, we believe it is necessary for it to be included the following elements. First, the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapon use should be rightfully acknowledged as a fundamental underpinning of the instrument. This must be accomplished in a means which does not point finger nor erode whatever trust exists with nuclear-armed states. Focusing on the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapon is not a pathway to vilifying any actor. Rather, it is about our collective judgment of how to deal with the inhumane and indiscriminate weapons. This should be done in a manner which points to something which should be plain and obvious to everyone in the room, that there are devastating human and environmental consequences resulting from the use of nuclear weapons. We have a moral obligation to our youngest and future generations. We should highlight the incredible risks faced every day that these weapons remain inexistent, and underscore that these risks must be reduced and ultimately eliminated and will remain as long as nuclear weapons exist. 2, include reference to the UNGA resolution on the ethical imperative for the nuclear weapon-free world, A/RES/71/55, which received the support of almost all states involved in the present negotiations. Specifically, we suggest that the state parties should indicate that they are convinced that, quote, nuclear weapons serve no legitimate purpose given their indiscriminate nature, inherent immorality, and potential to annihilate humanity and the planet as a whole, end of quote. Third, nuclear testing around the world has had and continues to have a disappropriate impact on indigenous communities, causing harm that can be considered widespread, long-term, and severe. Fourth and final, our experience should show how important it is for both terrestrial and marine environments to be considered when it comes to environmental remediation, and this should be mentioned in the preamble and in the operative part of the treaty. In light of our experience, it is our fervent hope that such weapon of mass destruction shall never again be tested or unleashed. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco a la distinguida delegación de...
I thank the distinguished representative of the Marshall Islands. Ireland has the floor now.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving me the floor again. For us, PP2 is a very important paragraph which highlights the multiple effects and impacts of nuclear weapons and their links to a variety of global issues, a point which my delegation has repeatedly stressed. 5 minutes ago, we had 3 suggestions which we believe would improve and further strengthen the paragraph, but your proposed amendment captures one of them almost entirely as an amendment we propose. Therefore, we have 2. Firstly, we suggest a small amendment in line 2 by replacing pose grave implications for human survival with pose a threat to the survival of humanity. This language is taken from the Humanitarian Pledge, which 127 states have signed, and we believe it more accurately reflects the magnitude of the threat posed by nuclear weapons for humanity as a whole. Therefore, with that amendment, the paragraph would read, cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons transcend national borders, pose a threat to the survival of humanity, the environment, socio-economic development, the global economy, food security, and so on. Secondly, we suggest adding a reference at the end of the paragraph that would run on nicely from your proposed text on women's empowerment and participation in the field of peace and security. And this is in line with commitments we have all undertaken under Security Council Resolution 1325. The reference would come after women and girls and would read as follows, and of the need to promote the equal, full and effective participation of both women and men in the process of nuclear disarmament. may be some little conjunction needed there, but the paragraph would end, and of the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on the health of women and girls, and of the need to promote the equal, full and effective participation of both women and men in the process of nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la delegación de Irlanda. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Sweden, followed by Liechtenstein and Indonesia.
Allow me first a couple of general remarks, since my delegation did not speak during the general segment. The first session of our negotiations was marked by seriousness and substance. There was also good interaction between member states and civil society. We hope that this session will be marked by the same features. Your draft for a convention shows that you and your team have listened carefully to views expressed during the first session, and the draft contains many elements that are likely to enjoy general agreement. And Sweden can support many elements of the first draft. But there are also areas where we see difficulties and room for improvement. We will present our suggestions in detail and propose amendments as we go through the draft during today and during the coming days. So you will probably hear from me several times during these days, and I ask you to bear with me during these interventions. Madam, if we manage in our joint endeavour to conclude our negotiations on a convention banning nuclear weapons on 7 July, which is possible, we will have taken an important step towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. We will also, as non-nuclear weapon state parties to the NPT, have contributed to the fulfillment of Article 6 in a way that is possible for us. We look forward to working with you and all other delegations on such a noble purpose. Now to preamble paragraph number 2. We would also like to address the gender issue, and your suggestion was definitely an improvement on the text. But we have a slightly different proposal, so we would like to delete the latter part of this paragraph, starting from "and of" until the end of that sentence, and replace them by 3 new paragraphs. I know that you said, Madam, that we should suggest new paragraphs at the end, but since this is a replacement, I will suggest them now. So the first would read, "Also cognizant of the disproportionate impact of ionization radiation on girls and women." Then, second new preamble paragraph, "Concerned by the low representation of women in multilateral disarmament forums." 3. Committed to the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, actively supporting the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in peace building, and stressing the importance of their equal and full involvement. So that would be our suggestion. We will present all our amendments in writing once we have finalized the cluster to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la.
I thank the delegation of Sweden. I now give the floor to Liechtenstein.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and thank you for your introduction to this paragraph. That is a very important paragraph for my delegation. I thank you in particular for the amendment you've put on the floor to make the provision on women and girls broader than it is currently in the text, and we could support that amendment. But we believe that the reference to the disproportionate impacts on women and girls should even be broader and have a proposal to that effect. It would read in the last line after disproportionate impact of nuclear weapons on women and girls, comma, including the impact of ionizing radiation on the health of women and girls. The intention of our amendment is to cover the breadth of the impacts on women and girls. That also includes particular vulnerabilities in humanitarian settings, for example, or other socioeconomic effects that disproportionately affect women and girls. We also had an amendment in the second line after the word borders, but it's actually been taken care of by the amendment of Ireland, which we can fully support. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Liechtenstein. Indonesia, now followed by Brazil.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, we do not have any general comment on the preamble, as this was rightfully pointed out by our DPR earlier this morning. I'd like to zoom in on preamble paragraph 2. And I thank you, Madam Chair, for your ruling today that we are focusing on para prepara. I think this is more systematic in how we do things and how we proceed further. On preamble paragraph 2, we would like to support the proposal made by Ireland to add pose a threat to the survival of humanity to replace the current text in reference to human survival. We would also like to support your proposal to replace maternal health and on girls. And on this paragraph, as I had mentioned earlier this morning, we have a new language, not a new paragraph, a new language on this paragraph, which reinforces the lack of capacity by any nations in coping with nuclear weapons and the aftermath of the devastation of nuclear weapons. So this new words or language would begin right after nuclear weapons in the first sentence. So it would read as follows: cognizant that the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons exceeds any nation's medical and rehabilitational capacity, comma, and its effects transcends national borders, and so on and so forth. So that would be our proposal, Madam Chair, particularly on this preamble paragraph 2. I thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Indonesia. And I give the floor to Brazil, followed by Austria.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
I'd like to support some of the proposals made so far on PP2. We would like to, first of all, support your own proposal to replace maternal health for women and girls, as we do believe that strengthens the paragraph. We would also like to support the Irish proposals made previously, both at the beginning of paragraph related to changing the language for pose a threat to the survival of humanity, to put this paragraph more in line with the humanitarian pledge, as well as later on in the paragraph to include also a broader reference to the role of women in disarmament. So we believe that these are very helpful additions to a paragraph. We also will be more carefully studying other proposals that have been made so far, but we do believe that having a stronger emphasis on gender would benefit our preamble. I thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Brazil. The delegation of Austria has the floor, followed by Egypt, Ecuador, and South Africa.
President, and I also welcome the change that you yourself have proposed. as the first part comes from the humanitarian pledge, I think it's a good idea, as my Irish colleague proposed, to stick to the formulation. So to put here, to pose a threat to the survival of humanity might be more correct to a language which was accepted by 127 countries. Then in the following part, Austria is also among the delegations that would like to widen the scope, even so we are content with the version that you just have proposed, to talk about the need to promote the effective participation of women in nuclear disarmament. And we have heard the Swedish proposal, which goes into the same direction. So from our point of view, it might be also for the sake of not having too many preamble imperatives, perhaps a good way to follow the Irish proposal, which we would like to support. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Austria. The delegation of Egypt has the floor, followed by Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Madam President. My delegation is fine with some of the proposals made by countries regarding PP2. With reference to the part on the health of future generations, we were of the belief that we could propose maybe an addition that's the health of present and future generations, because the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons as outlined in PP2 is not just simply implicated on the future generations, but also health, so on the present. So we would be of the view to propose the health of present and future generations. That is my only proposal for PP2. The only remark that I would like to also add is a comment on a delegation which preferred to make reference to a particular United Nations Security Council resolution, even though the content of this resolution we would have to look at it into. We are of the view that maybe we were caution against putting in the preamble specific specifications of United Nations Security Council resolutions, outlining them in specific. I would encourage this delegation maybe to present it in terms of the content that exists in this Security Council resolution and outlining it in verbatim. I think that would be helpful to us all. But specifically making reference in the preamble to specific resolutions, I think I would caution against that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Egypt. I now give the floor to the delegation of Ecuador, followed by South Africa, Nigeria, and Iran. Ecuador. Thank you very much, Madam President. Since it's the first time I'm taking the floor for substantive discussion, this is the time to thank you in public and your team for preparing this draft treaty, which we feel, and we've also been able to tell you this personally, we feel that in terms of its structure as well as its content is an excellent basis in order to arrive at a successful conclusion of the conference. I must refer, Madam President, to the fact that in line with your request and the decision taken this morning by the conference, my delegation, which also has a lot to say about the future treaty, its importance and its content, abstained from making a general statement. And therefore, because we didn't take the floor in a segment that lasted about 2 hours, and which in effect were general statements, that could have disadvantaged us in as much as our views would not be reflected in the record of this second session. Ecuador has consulted with our authorities with regard to what's happened, and although the most appropriate thing would be to make our own statement under this section, in respect in order to respect your request and the decision that we took in the conference this morning, and above all, in view of the very short amount of time that we have to complete our work, it was decided that we would abstain from delivering that general statement. But in any event, our opinion was put forward during the general debate that did take place at the beginning of the conference. And this was the case for other delegations as well. We repeat our support for your leadership of our work, Madam President, and this support will be expressed as far as possible by following the procedural order that you have established in order for us to conclude our work successfully. Now, with regard to paragraph 2, we've been taking note of the various proposals, and in order to be interactive, perhaps I can make a comment very similar to the one made by my colleague and neighbour here, Egypt, with regard to a reference to Resolution 325 of the Security Council, 1325. Now, certainly we could look at the content of it, and certainly Resolution 1325 of the Security Council is not the most appropriate instrument to be used here in reference to our treaty. But if we do want to refer to a document passed by another body, Resolution 7156 on disarmament would be appropriate. Not prevention of violence, which is more what 1325 deals with. But in technical and legal terms, I'm not so sure whether referring to a resolution in a preamble to this document, whatever title we give it, is it a good idea to make reference to resolutions from any other body? If there's an idea in those resolutions that is relevant and interesting, then we feel it would be better to include that text in the form of a paragraph. So, concluding this first substantive intervention of my delegation, we also have proposals for new preambular paragraphs related to this one, but once again, in line with your request, we will present those at the end of the cluster. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the distinguished delegate of Ecuador. We also take note of the consultations you've had with your authorities and that you're abstaining now from making a general statement. But as I said, you still are able to give us that statement so that we can put it on the website that we have. But thank you for your understanding. But I'm sure that both delegations can discuss the reference to the resolution with the Marshall Islands. South Africa has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Good afternoon to you and good afternoon to colleagues. My delegation takes the floor to, first of all, support your amendment that you made in the PP2, as well as to support the proposal as made by the distinguished colleague from Ireland. Thanks very much.
Le agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of South Africa. Nigeria has the floor, followed by Iran and Mexico.
Thank you, Madam President. Our intervention at this stage is just to encourage you, because it appears your addition to that paragraph speaks to the issue, because we're not limited now. So if we direct the issue straight at women, then we know we're talking about women. So that is fine by us. And just as our dear colleague from South Africa said, regarding the proposal by Ireland, it's fine by us, particularly the latter part, which Madam President also agreed on to. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, la delegación de
Thank you very much to the delegation of Nigeria. Mexico, followed the delegation of Iran, followed by Mexico, and then Venezuela. Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, on this preamble paragraph, we are comfortable with the paragraph that you have drafted. We have no problem with that. Of course, with most of amendments that proposed by different delegations also, we have no problem. We think that most of them are promotional, particularly two suggestions made by Ireland regarding the adding any use of nuclear weapons in the first line and adding a threat to human survival in the second line. I think both of them has their own merit and valuable suggestions which deserve to be supported. But just regarding the last suggestion made by Sweden and Ireland regarding the role of women, we do believe that the role of women are very important and, of course, can be dealt with in paragraph 12. 12 of preamble paragraph 12. But here in this paragraph, we are talking about the consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. That I'm afraid that having such a suggestions here would be unrelated to the content of this paragraph. So we suggest that those proposals go to that paragraph and would be considered under 12. Thank you.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Iran. I give the floor to Mexico, followed by Venezuela, and then Mozambique. Thank you very much, Madam President. A brief intervention, first of all, to support the amendment that you put forward and also to support the amendments put forward by Ireland and Egypt. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de México.
Thank you, Mexico. I now give the floor to the delegation of Venezuela, followed by Mozambique.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd like to begin by congratulating you for the draft text of the convention that you circulated a few days ago. We think that the proposal that the conference is examining is very valuable for our delegation. It's a good basis to making a contribution to the goal that we've set ourselves, which is the adoption of a convention that prohibits nuclear weapons. With regard to paragraph 2, preambular paragraph 2, that you were kind enough to introduce this afternoon, we can support the amendment that you read out. We also feel that the suggestions made by Ireland are fairly positive, and my delegation would also be in a position to accept them. However, we feel, as was pointed out by the distinguished representative of Egypt, that referring to Resolution 1325 would not be a good idea. It wouldn't be very appropriate, because it's not very usual in instruments of this nature to refer to Security Council resolutions. So once again, we thank you for introducing this text, and we're very glad to be here discussing it. Thank you.
Le agradezco mucho, Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Venezuela, for those kind words. Mozambique now has the floor.
seguida de...
Followed by Singapore.
Madam President, taking the floor in order to just support your proposal. And I think that it is important that as far as possible we support the text of the President as presented, unless we have a very strong opinion, because we have many draft PPs that we have to deal with, and if we take so long in discussing each draft preamble paragraph, I don't think that time will be enough. So I would like to support very strongly your proposal. Secondly, I would like to echo what Egypt, Ecuador said, that to the extent possible we should avoid bringing into the text of the future treaty mention of a draft resolution or a resolution that has been adopted by the General Assembly or Security Council. Those resolutions should serve the purpose of justifying our position, not of bringing them into the future draft treaty or convention. So this is basically what I would like to say at this stage. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Mozambique.
Thank you very much, Mozambique. Iran has the floor, followed by Singapore and Sweden.
I'm sorry to ask the floor again, Madam President. Just for the sake of clarification, since this part, preamble part, doesn't have numbering, I made a mistake in calling the, preamble paragraph 14. I said in paragraph 12, while I had to say 14. This is the first point. The second point, I would like to take advantage of this opportunity to say that regarding 1325 resolution, also I have the same views that has been mentioned by Ecuador and other friends. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Iran.
Thank you very much, Iran. Singapore has the floor, followed by Sweden.
Thank you, Madam President. As this is the first time I'm taking the floor, Singapore would like to congratulate you on the assumption of the presidency of the conference and express our appreciation for your leadership thus far. Our view is that the draft convention that has been circulated by you is a good reflection of the points of convergence at the March meeting and a solid foundation to build on going forward. Madam Chair, with respect to the particular preambular paragraph, preambular paragraph 2, we have been listening carefully to the many proposals made. In particular, we would like to support the proposal made by Ireland to align the reference to the human survival with past agreed language. We would also like to support Egypt's proposal to add present and future generations. Madam Chair, if you permit me, we had refrained from making a general statement, but we would like to offer some brief comments on the preamble as a whole. In this regard, Singapore associates itself with the earlier statements delivered by Thailand and the Philippines on behalf of ASEAN. Overall, we are pleased with the balance contained in the preamble, which contains elements we deem important, including the mention of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, the recognition of the suffering of the victims of the use and testing of nuclear weapons, as well as the recognition of the crucial importance of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We have also heard many delegations this morning emphasize the importance of an existing disarmament architecture, and also the convention should not impose any additional obligations on non-nuclear weapon states. Singapore concurs with this view. In this regard, we would like to suggest that we either strengthen the preambular paragraph 13 or we add another preambular paragraph which would stress our desire to work on a new convention that will complement and build on existing treaties, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaties, and other existing treaties concerning nuclear weapon-free zones, including the Southeast Asia Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone Treaty. This would, in our view, build upon the language in PP 13 and reinforce the compatibility between the Convention and the existing disarmament architecture. We will propose some language when we get to that paragraph or later at the end of the day. Process-wise, we would like to highlight that there may be interlinkages between paragraphs within the preambular section and between the preambular section and other sections. For example, as suggested by the distinguished representative of Malaysia earlier, the preambular section could potentially be useful as a section for compromise. We understand the rationale of a cluster-by-cluster discussion and suggest that it may be useful to allocate some time later in due course to contemplate such linkages. One other suggestion we have is that at the end of our discussion on a cluster, so preambular, our discussion on preambular section, perhaps it would be useful for the chair to circulate a complete list of the proposals as made during the discussion on that particular section. But we continue to stand guided by you, Madam President, and will work constructively with you to contribute to a successful outcome of the conference. I thank you, Madam President.
Agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of Singapore. You also referred to the need to link the discussion on the preamble with the other parts of the text. I'd like to give the floor now to Sweden.
Thank you, Madam. And I apologize for taking the floor again, but since a number of delegations commented on the proposal that I made, and I listened very carefully to them and to their advice, I would like to rephrase the proposal that I made, and it would then read as follows instead. Supporting the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts and in peace building, and stressing the importance of their equal and full involvement. Then there would be no direct reference to the UN Security Council resolution. And as to where to place these two paragraphs on the low representation of women and the important role of women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, I am in your hands, Madam. They do not necessarily have to be placed here. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la delegación de...
I thank the delegation of Sweden for that rewording. We're taking note of that. It's also in response to comments that we've heard in the room. The delegation of Ecuador has asked for the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And thank you to the delegation of Sweden for reformulating the proposal. Yes, that's more along the lines, more or less along the lines of what we are suggesting. But we were saying that if we want to have a reference to the real important role that women really do play in the area of disarmament for the delegation of Ecuador, Resolution 7156 on women and disarmament, non-proliferation and arms control would be a more appropriate reference. I'm not going to read it, but I just think it would be better, and it would also cover the idea that Sweden wants to introduce. For example, there is a preambular paragraph in 7156 that says
of women in disarmament. That's what we are doing here. Non-proliferation, we are certainly aiding to that. In arms control, should be further developed, and in particular, they need to facilitate the participation and representation of women in policymaking, planning, and implementation process related to disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control. Regreso al español.
I'll go back to Spanish now. We feel that for the spirit and goal of this treaty, perhaps this is a discussion that we could have, namely that this resolution would be more appropriate, because obviously it's more relevant than Security Council Resolution 1325 that talks about prevention of conflict. Although really I'm not sure that this is exactly what we're dealing with. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la...
I thank the delegation of Ecuador, and I see the delegation of Sweden also consulting. Perhaps those two delegations could get together and discuss their interest on this item. Well, since there are no more delegations asking for the floor to refer to PP2, let's move on to PP3. In the preamble.
El tercer párrafo de la parte
The third paragraph of the preamble is related to this general concept of the humanitarian impact, and it says,
the victims of the use of nuclear weapons, Ibakusha, in parentheses, as well as those affected by the testing of nuclear weapons. Quisiera abrir entonces.
So I'd now like to open the floor for comments from delegations on this paragraph, which clearly refers to the calls made in March to include a reference to this group of people affected by the use of or the testing of nuclear weapons. And now we're reaching the end of this section on the humanitarian impact. So those delegations that said they had some suggestions, this would be the time to propose them. The delegation of Brazil has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We have a small amendment to propose to this paragraph. It seeks to emphasize the issue of harm to victims of the use of nuclear weapons and to describe them as something that is unacceptable. It tries to align it with the language used in the humanitarian pledge. It's the same logic that was presented by another delegation in trying to extract language that comes from previously agreed documents by a majority of members. And in this case, we think that we should go beyond just being mindful of the suffering. I think we should be mindful of the unacceptable harm suffered by the victims. So it goes along the same line as, I think, a previous amendment to paragraph 1 or 2 that was made by another delegation, also using the word unacceptable. I think we have to be clear as to what we really think about the effect on victims. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la delegación de Brasil. Tiene la...
I thank the delegation of Brazil. Austria has the floor, followed by South Africa.
First of all, I would like to thank you that you took this into the draft. I think it's very fitting that this future legal instrument honors in this way the Hibakusha and also the victims of testing. With regard to the intervention of the delegation of Brazil. I think they have a point, because we try to stick to formulations that we have used, and 127 countries have used the unacceptable harm. It's not a big difference, I think, but it facilitates our work when we stick to broadly accepted formulations. At this point, I would like to offer an additional PP regarding the humanitarian consequences. And it comes also from the humanitarian pledge. And it deals with the risks associated with nuclear weapons and the link to the security, which was mentioned by other delegations before. And it would read like this: emphasizing that the consequences of a nuclear weapon explosion and the risks associated with nuclear weapons concern the security of all humanity, and that all states share the responsibility to prevent any use of nuclear weapons. Of course, I will give it to you in written. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de África.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Austria. South Africa has the floor, followed by Nigeria and Ireland.
Thank you, Madam President. Since we have come to the end of this humanitarian consequences cluster, we would like to place our proposal. But before that, we've listened to the distinguished delegate from Brazil and Austria and the proposal they've made. And just to say that my delegation fully supports the proposals as made. Coming now to our proposal, Madam President, during our intervention this morning, we highlighted two proposals that we will make. In this regard, it is the view of South Africa that the paragraphs of the preamble dealing with humanitarian impact and consequences need also to recognize the ethical and moral imperatives for a world free of nuclear weapons, as contained in various resolutions adopted by the General Assembly. Our proposals, we will send our proposal to the Secretariat, Madam President. But just for the benefit of us all, I'll just quickly quote, acknowledging the ethical imperatives for nuclear disarmament and the agency of achieving and maintaining a nuclear weapon-free world, which is a global public good of the highest order, serving both national and collective security interest. End quote. This is a proposal, Madam President, and we request that you consider it positively. We will send it to the Secretariat as soon as possible. We are, however, very flexible on where you place it within the humanitarian cluster. Thanks very much.
Muchas gracias, Sudáfrica.
Thank you very much, South Africa, Nigeria, followed by Ireland, Ecuador, and Ghana.
Thank you, Madam President. You did say that we are getting to the end game of the paragraphs on humanitarian consequences. Of course, there is no doubt that my delegation aligns with the position of Brazil and Austria, including the immediate speaker, our dear friend from South Africa, regarding the imperative of the ethical imperative of nuclear weapons, of the consequences of nuclear weapons. And as we said in the morning, Madam Chair, we are looking at a treaty that addresses the need to ban nuclear weapons. And I think it's like a problem foretold in 1946 with the first UN General Assembly resolution that speaks directly to the problems. It says to establish a commission to deal with the problems raised by the discovery of atomic energy. It's like seeing into the future. So we are living with the reality now, but then we feel that there's the need to properly reflect and articulate this going forward in this during the course of our negotiation here. But we feel that it's your call, Madam President, wherever you wish to reflect it and in whatever way, shape, or form. But we do believe that we cannot escape the fact that we need to go back to the past if we want to understand the future. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Gracias a la delegación de Nigeria.
Thank you to the delegation of Nigeria. Ireland has the floor.
Thank you again, Madam President. I think we've heard a few proposals in the last few moments that really help to root the proposed treaty in a very solid basis. Maybe just to deal with the comments people have made serially, one by one, starting with the proposed amendment from Brazil. Ireland can support this proposal very much. It's a simple proposal, or simple amendment, and it also helps to contribute to the stigmatisation effect that we're hoping to achieve with this treaty. Turning then to the new material or the new proposals, I think a fundamentally important factor supporting the prohibition of nuclear weapons is the question of risk and the growing risk of a nuclear detonation, whether intentional, mistaken or accidental. So I think we very much agree on the need to insert a reference on this important element in the preamble and can certainly support the suggestion made by Austria. Coming to the other end of the hemisphere, to South Africa, I think again in making our case is what we're doing here in the preamble. We very much agree that a reference to the ethical and the moral dimension of weapons of mass destruction and the critical importance of nuclear disarmament for national security and collective security would be well placed. And again, Ireland can support the proposal from South Africa. And similarly, we've had a couple of references to resolutions from outside of our normal space. But I think the Nigerian proposal to reach back to the GA resolution has value, has validity, and we could certainly support the inclusion of a new paragraph that talks about previous resolutions where there's concern expressed at the grave humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. I think collectively all of these support the basic case that we're trying to make of the need for this treaty. And I think the exact wording we can worry about a little bit later, but I think those are important points to include. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Irlanda.
Thank you very much, Ireland. The delegation of Ecuador has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, within this humanitarian subcluster of the preamble, several proposals have been made. We'd like to make a few of our own. One relates to the communities that were directly affected by nuclear detonations and particularly by nuclear tests in various parts of the world, in the Pacific Islands, in Australia, in the sub-Saharan desert, and also in the west of the United States, and basically indigenous peoples. So we would like to propose a paragraph that would read, recognizing the disproportionate impact that nuclear explosions have had on indigenous peoples in various parts of the world. And I'll try to translate that into English.
Recognizing the disproportionate impact that nuclear explosions have had on indigenous peoples in different parts of the world. Esto usa la expresión pueblos indígenas.
That uses the expression indigenous peoples, and that's the UN term, and that's why I've included that. Then there's a second issue that's mentioned, and we certainly welcome this in paragraph 2, with regard to the impact on socio-economic development of nuclear weapons. However, we feel that this is very important and it should be given its own paragraph. And to this end, we would propose the following language. Recalling the negative impact that development and modernization of nuclear weapons has on socio-economic development. Once again, proposing my translation in English.
Impact that the development and modernization of nuclear weapons has on socio-economic development. And sobre este punto,
and on this point, Madam President, we should recall that before we were able to consider the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, there was a clear awareness on the socio-economic impact that the modernization of these weapons would have. And with your indulgence, I'd just like to quote something briefly from a declaration made more or less at the beginning of the arms race by Dwight Eisenhower, president at the time, on the 16th of April 1953, and I think it's known by many of us, but I recall it because it's important.
That is made. Every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. Contra esto estamos también combatiendo.
And we're also fighting this fight. Thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco.
I thank the delegation of Ecuador for your proposals. We now have on the speakers list Ghana, Cuba, Nigeria, Mexico, and Sweden. The delegation of Ghana has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Since this is the first time of taking the floor, Ghana wishes to assure you of our support. Madam President, the draft document before us, we believe, is a good basis for our discussions. Madam President, as earlier expressed this morning by a delegation of South Africa and supported by Ireland and Australia, my delegation would also like to re-echo, as the other delegations, that the title should be reconsidered again. Our view is that a draft treaty will be appropriate, since this instrument will be an agreement between state parties, instead of a convention which is more of normative in nature. And so our view is that draft treaty will be the appropriate word. Also, regarding PP2, my delegation supports the submission by Ireland and the amendments made by your good self. Specifically, in line 2, we support the view that the rendition there poses grave implications for human survival should be changed to pose a threat to humanity, as proposed by Ireland. We find that as very simple and straightforward. On PP3, we also agree with the proposal by Brazil. We think that what is pushing the world to this level is the unacceptable consequences. And so, as proposed by Brazil, we think that it should not just be mindful of the suffering, but we should add the unacceptable harm to ensure that there's that level of coherence between the language and the text. I thank you.
Le agradezco a la delegación de Ghana.
I thank the delegation of Ghana. The delegation of Cuba has the floor, followed by Nigeria, Mexico, and Sweden. Brazil, Argentina, and Cuba. Delegation of Nigeria has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and sorry for coming back to you again. I just feel, in as much as we would not have minded you drafting the para in line with our proposal and submission, but I just want to believe we read out what we believe should be the acceptable para, and perhaps our dear colleagues and delegates will reflect on that. Of course, that does not mean that Madam President cannot find a way to make it cleaner and better. So I'll take it in dictation form, Madam President. So the para should read, recalling that concern about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons has been reflected in numerous United Nations resolutions, including the first resolution adopted by the General Assembly on 24 January 1946. I can take that again with your permission, Madam President. Recalling that concern about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons has been reflected in numerous United Nations resolutions, including the first resolution adopted by the General Assembly on 24 January 1946. I thank you, Madam Chair.
Gracias, Nigeria. Tiene la...
Thank you, Nigeria. The delegation of Cuba has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. With regard to Preamble paragraph 3, Cuba can support this without any problems. We think it's an important paragraph, and here we would welcome and support the proposal put forward by Brazil, which we feel helps to improve this paragraph. And then we'd also like to express our agreement with the intervention just made by Ecuador, when they said that in their view, the socio-humanitarian impact, and I'd add financial impact, of nuclear programs should be dealt with in a separate paragraph of the preamble, given the great relevance of this matter. And we feel that the draft paragraph that Ecuador put forward is very good, and we could support it. However, we have our own proposal for a paragraph on that, which I will submit for consideration by delegations, and I'll read it out in English. It would be a new paragraph, PP3 bis.
Bearing in mind that significant resources are spent on nuclear weapons programs, and reaffirming the need to devote part of the resources made available by the implementation of disarmament and arms limitation agreements to economic and social development. Quisiera explicar, señora.
And I'd like to explain, Madam President, that the main ideas in this new paragraph being proposed by Cuba are drawn from the annual resolution approved by the General Assembly from the First Committee on the issue of disarmament and development. The last of those, recently approved, was 7162, which has the support of the General Assembly. So these are not new ideas. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias, Cuba.
Thank you very much, Cuba. Once again, please let the Secretariat have those proposals in writing. Mexico, Sweden, Brazil, Argentina, Austria, and Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Firstly, with regard to preambular paragraph 3, my delegation could support Brazil's proposal because we feel that this is consistent with the humanitarian aspect. We could also support the proposal for a new paragraph with regard to the risks associated with nuclear weapons presented by Austria, and with regard to the South African paragraph on the ethical aspect imperative, and also Nigeria's proposal with regard to referring to the first General Assembly resolution in 1946. We could accept that, and we could also accept including a reference to the socio-economic impact on the development as presented by Ecuador and Cuba. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mexico. Sweden.
We can support your proposal for PP3, but there were also many other sensible proposals made that we could support. But however, we have some difficulties with one of the proposals that were made, and that is on the ethical imperatives for a nuclear weapons-free world. I mean, this is a resolution that does not enjoy the consensus of the General Assembly, and in our view, it would be better if we could limit ourselves to resolutions that have been adopted by consensus. Thank you.
Gracias, Suecia.
Thank you, Sweden, Brazil, followed by Argentina, Austria, and Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Excuse me for taking the floor once more, but I think there were so many additional proposals after I spoke that I wish to express Brazil's support to practically all of them, I guess. The proposal by Austria on the issue of risks associated with nuclear weapons that concern security of all humanity and the shared responsibility of all states to prevent any use of nuclear weapons. Also, the one by Nigeria, which recalls the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapon reflected in numerous UN resolutions, including the first adopted by the General Assembly. South Africa, contrary to the previous intervention, we could fully support that on the ethical and moral imperatives proposed by South Africa. We appreciate support for adding unacceptable harm, as was suggested by Brazil, but we also wish to make a brief reference to some of Ecuador's suggestion and Cuba. I think the issue of social economic development and disarmament is very relevant, and it has been developed on several occasions historically within the UN in different contexts, and I think it's a welcome proposition by Ecuador to have language on that. The Cuban proposal, I think, further elaborates on it. It speaks of diversion of resources made available by disarmament measures into for social and economic development, which I think it's obviously an extremely desirable thing to happen, an aspiration of all of the members of this organization. I think the relationship, on the mentioning the disproportional impact on indigenous populations could have a bearing on this treaty as proposed by Ecuador. We have singled out other vulnerable populations as well, in particular women and girls, I think, on the ionizing radiation previously. The hibakushas, I think there's also the issue of testing having taken place on several areas of the world where there were very vulnerable indigenous populations that were affected without even perhaps having the full knowledge of what was happening to them. So I think there is a strong relationship and a strong basis for us to make a reference to that. And I also would have liked to support on the previous point Ecuador's suggestion that the Assembly Resolution 7156 from the First Committee is a better, perhaps, platform for recognizing the role of women on disarmament. So I didn't have a chance to support that one. I do it now. Thank you.
Gracias, Brasil. Tiene la...
Thank you, Brazil. Argentina, followed by Austria and Venezuela. Thank you, Madam President. Since it's the first time that my delegation is taking the floor, allow me to express the full support of Argentina to you and as you conduct the work of this conference. With regard to the draft convention, we feel it's a good basis for negotiations. I was going to refer to PP4 because we have a concern about this. We see it related to 2. I don't know if that's possible, or do you want to finish this cluster and then you want to go into 4? Okay, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Argentina.
Thank you very much, Argentina. Austria, followed by Venezuela and the State of Palestine.
President, indeed, we had so many good suggestions. So I want to support the South African one because the ethical dimension is very important. It's underlying our endeavor, and therefore we certainly need language on this, so we fully support this. With regard to the proposal by Nigeria, we think, as it is usual in preamble parts, to have a little bit this historic dimension, and so it adds to the value when we take in the Nigerian proposal. My delegation shares the interest that was expressed already this morning by Bangladesh, now by Ecuador, by Cuba, by Brazil, that among the preamble language we should also have a very clear mentioning of the negative impact that the nuclear weapons development, maintenance, and modernization has on social and economic development. So we will have to choose some kind of language, and so my delegation is attracted by the Ecuadorian proposal, which is rather succinct. It's just that we would like to add in between development and modernization of nuclear weapons maintenance, because this too is extremely costly, and these amounts of money could be used for development. We also can support the proposal by Ecuador regarding including language on indigenous people, because it reflects what has happened. So with this, I think the preamble part is getting longer.
Gracias, Austria. Venezuela.
Thank you, Austria, Venezuela, followed by the State of Palestine and South Africa. Thank you very much, Madam President. Very briefly, we'd like to state our support for PP3, as well as the addition suggested by Brazil. With regard to the proposals made by Ecuador and Cuba. Venezuela fully supports them. We feel that they are extremely relevant, particularly the point related to the impact of nuclear tests on indigenous peoples, those historic tests that have been carried out. We feel that a recognition of this kind in the preamble would be extremely important. With regard to the socio-economic impact of the modernization of nuclear weapons and development of nuclear weapons, we feel that the Ecuadorian proposal, as well as the proposal of the distinguished ambassador of Cuba, are complementary, and so my delegation can support both of them. Thank you.
Gracias, Venezuela.
Thank you, Venezuela. State of Palestine, South Africa, and Ecuador.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We also agree with these proposals that were made to add to the preamble, and we think that there are very important principles and language that is present in existing texts that reflect the consensus among the community of nations, either in previous conventions or in previous resolutions. We had mentioned Resolution 7158, some had mentioned Resolution 71258. We spoke of other treaties, and maybe in the course of the discussion we're having, the last preambular paragraph of the NPT contains two important ideas. One that is not to be still addressed here, which is the threat or use of force against territorial integrity or political independence. But the second idea is related to diversion of economic and human resources to armament and trying to limit that diversion. So we have also these principles reflected elsewhere, and that is helpful for us when we proceed. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. The delegation of South Africa, followed by Ecuador, and that is the last delegation that has asked for the floor on this sub-cluster. South Africa.
Thank you, Madam President. We take the floor to offer our support to the proposal made by our colleague from Nigeria. We think it's a very important resolution that he has made reference to, and we support the proposal. Secondly, we also noted the proposals from Ecuador and Cuba on the issue of a socio-economic and financial dimension, and we think that these are very good and of course important ideas, and we are looking forward to seeing the proposals as presented. Thanks.
Gracias, Sudáfrica. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you, South Africa. The delegation of Ecuador has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. Very briefly, and of course, many thanks to the distinguished ambassador of Cuba for his proposal with regard to disarmament and development, and it also goes back to the first session that used that kind of language. That's important. These resources being diverted in this way is important, and what Austria said is as well is very important, to recall that in the maintenance of these weapons a lot of resources are diverted. So we're moving in the same direction, and I think we should be able to find a common language. And of course my delegation is extremely flexible on this. With regard to Austria's proposal on the ethical impact or impacts, my delegation had a specific proposal on that. So, of course, we do support South Africa's proposal, and we'll need to see whether it's exactly the same text. I don't think it is, but we'll need to take a closer look at it. And if I may, I'd like to read out our proposal. It's a little long, but it's taken from paragraphs H and I of Resolution 7175, and I'll read it out, and I won't translate it this time. It would say, recognizing that the use of nuclear weapons, irrespective of their cause, is incompatible with the requirements of international humanitarian law or international law, the laws of morality or the dictates of public conscience, given their indiscriminate nature and the possibility that their use could lead to the annihilation of mankind, these arms are inherently immoral. That is the message from my delegation, and that is the message that I think we should include in the treaty. These weapons are illegal, but above all, because of their humanitarian impact and their indiscriminate effect, they are immoral. And finally, Madam President, and we're coming back to this item, I think it's very important. I've been looking at the current session of the General Assembly, and Resolution 7156 was adopted without a vote in the General Assembly, so by consensus. The resolution as a whole, and that's important. Personally, I would prefer something adopted by consensus by 193 states rather than by 15, referring to one of the many other organs that make up this organization. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Ecuador. I'm very happy to see that there is a very positive interaction between delegations and that there are various areas where there's a meeting of minds, and those delegations that have made suggestions for paragraphs, I think, should discuss them amongst themselves because they are very convergent. And then perhaps you can put forward those paragraphs after your consultations. We've also been talking about the impact of nuclear weapons on gender issues in general, and I've also got two delegations that have asked for the floor, and I'd like to give the floor, therefore, to the Marshall Islands and Costa Rica that asked for the floor. First of all, the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for giving me the floor. In terms of Preamble paragraph 3, the Marshall Islands, this is one of the paragraphs that is very close to the experiences of the Marshall Islands and its populations. We made statements in the March session in regards to the previous experiences of our peoples during the nuclear testing that was conducted. We therefore have been listening to the many proposals and the suggestions for a strengthening of this paragraph, and we are supportive of this, and we would like to see how that will look in text. We're also supportive of the proposals on humanitarian consequences, as well as the ethical imperative proposals. We also would like to support the references to the impacts to indigenous communities, and this is another area that is a very close experience of the Marshall Islands, and we would like to see how all of these proposals will now look in a new formulation, and we look forward to that, Madam President. Thank you.
Gracias, Islas Marshall.
Thank you, Marshall Islands. Costa Rica has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. Since it's the first time that we're taking the floor, allow me to congratulate you on presenting this first draft of the convention. We think it's a very good basis for negotiation. We've listened very carefully to the text proposals with regard to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Firstly, we support Brazil's addition to PP3. We also agree with South Africa that the ethical and moral aspects should be included in the preamble, and so we support the inclusion of their proposal. Likewise, we support the proposal made with regard to the risks of a nuclear explosion. The only way that we can eliminate that risk is to have the certainty that nuclear weapons will not be used under any circumstances. Also, the proposals of Ecuador and Cuba on the negative economic impact on development that the maintenance of nuclear weapons has is important. We feel that that's important, and those aspects should also be reflected in the text. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Costa Rica. So I now like to close that subcluster, for want of a better term, related to the humanitarian impact, and I'd say that it was a very rich discussion, and we've had a good interaction between delegations, and we certainly have some homework now for the delegations that have been proposing some texts relating as well to the socio-economic impact, the impact on indigenous peoples, and the ethical impact and the role of women in these cases. So I'd ask you to get together before you bring the texts to us so that you've already consulted on them, on those areas of convergence. We've also noted in the discussion of the paragraphs that at least one delegation pointed this out. There are a number of interactions or interlinkages between various paragraphs in the subclusters. We've noted that the discussion has been very enriching. We've created a very good working environment. And since we do have that positive environment, I think we could move on to the next part of the preamble now, which is the subcluster, if you will, relating to international law and international humanitarian law. And I suggest that we go through this cluster together and consider the interlinkages between the paragraphs. I think that that will help us to make effective progress. I've got two delegations asking for the floor, Ecuador and New Zealand. Is it to refer to the previous cluster? Is it a clarification on the previous cluster? Ecuador, you have the floor. I just needed to correct something, Madam President. You asked us to consult with each other. Obviously, I thought that we had accepted the reference to the disarmament resolution and the ethical imperatives, but I'd like to clarify that first of all, and I'm sorry if that led to some confusion. But on the other hand, we've had this discussion in very many different fora. All resolutions adopted by the General Assembly have the same validity. You don't have first and second class resolutions. Unfortunately, the resolution that led to this conference was not adopted by consensus, but here we all are and we're still discussing it. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ecuador. New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. No, I had just assumed that you were opening the floor for comments on the IHL cluster, so I was very determined not to miss my opportunity.
Permítame entonces aclarar.
So please allow me to clarify the following. We've completed the first subcluster of paragraphs that are interrelated with regard to the humanitarian impact, and we've found a good degree of convergence between delegations, and there are countries that have proposed new paragraphs, and I've asked them to please put their heads together to work on those paragraphs, so that when they give us those paragraphs, we're able to take into account those interactions that we've seen today. And now we're going to look at the paragraphs related to international law and international humanitarian law.
Also, in terms of this mechanic that I am proposing to expedite our discussion and to take advantage of the good atmosphere, let me then go to some brief explanations on the paragraphs. I'm not going to read the paragraphs because you already have them before you and you have already studied them. Let me mention then the paragraph 4. Reflects the call for the preamble to include a restatement of the basic principles of international humanitarian law that most directly bear on the use of nuclear weapons. The elements draw from various articles in the additional protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Upon further reflection, in editing this paragraph, we lost references to some important rules of IHL, which could be reflected, such as the rules of distinction and precautions. I therefore welcome the inputs from delegations on how to improve this paragraph, that of course is very important. In terms of paragraph 5, this paragraph reflects the strong desire for the Convention to reflect a strong prohibition of nuclear weapons and to ground such a prohibition firmly in international humanitarian law. The language in this paragraph is building on the finding by the International Court of Justice in its 1996 advisory opinion, which reads, as we all know, "It follows from the above-mentioned requirements that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, and in particular the principles and rules of humanitarian law." As reflected in the language I just quoted, the ICJ was not able to conclude definitely whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state would be at stake. The proposed language in the paragraph, which is in the form of a very strong declaration by the parties, expresses no such uncertainty. This reflects the call that nuclear weapons should never be used again under any circumstances. Regarding Article 6, this paragraph reflects the calls to reaffirm the famous Martens Clause, as was done in the preamble of the Cluster Munitions Convention. The language is drawn from Article 1, Paragraph 2 of the Additional Protocol 1 to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. This is a very brief introduction so that we can open the floor for your comments to this sub-cluster regarding the relationship of this instrument to international law and international humanitarian law. The floor is open. Ahora sí, embajadora Hige, tiene usted la palabra para
Ambassador Hige, you now have the floor to refer to the cluster on international humanitarian law, followed by Argentina and Liechtenstein.
Thank you very much, Madam President. New Zealand would like to propose a new preambular paragraph as the entry point to this segment or cluster on international law and IHL So we would be proposing it after current PP3, but of course if additional preamble paragraphs indeed get incorporated into the text, as has been suggested here today, we would be proposing this new preambular paragraph to be inserted at whatever was the entry point to the IHL international law segment. We would like to propose text which in fact draws on consensus language taken from the 2010 NPT outcome document, and our proposal would be a preambular paragraph which says, reaffirming the obligation on all states at all times to comply with international law, including international humanitarian law. As you yourself have just said, Madam President, it's very important that we have a very full and comprehensive outline of the terms of IHL as they appear now in PP4, but in fact, PP4, as currently drafted, lacks some elements, and you invited delegations to take up your request that language be put forward that remedies the various omissions. Accordingly, we would like to suggest an amendment to that, but with an additional standalone preambular paragraph as its particular entry point, and we would suggest that this new preambular paragraph state, quote, aware that the right of the parties to an armed conflict to choose methods and means of warfare is not unlimited. That would be our entry point into the redrafted, more inclusive language to follow as in PP4 at present, and the language we would suggest for redrafted PP4 is basing themselves on the principles and rules of international humanitarian law, including the rules of distinction and precaution, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the rule on proportionality in attack, the prohibition on the use of weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, and the rules on the protection of the natural environment. We hope that that covers comprehensively the tenets of IHL, but we are very grateful if anyone can correct or expand on this to ensure that it is very properly done. Finally, in the context of IHL, Madam President, we would like to propose a slight reframing of the Martens Clause as it is currently set out in PP6, and we would suggest that an amended PP6 might say, stressing that any use of nuclear weapons would be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. We think that that appropriately characterizes the Martens Clause, but without opening up the issue that one delegation raised this morning about exactly which cases would not be covered by this convention. I don't think we need to go there. We simply restate the important impact of the Martens Clause. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of New Zealand. Argentina, Iran, Liechtenstein, Cuba, Switzerland, the state of Palestine, and Sweden have asked for the floor. Argentina.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. On preambular paragraph 4, Argentina welcomes the additional protocol of the Geneva Conventions being referred to. But as we said in our previous statement, we feel there's a direct relationship here with PP2. And that's why our suggestion was to end the paragraph after unlimited. With regard to PP6, Argentina would like to support the language proposal made by New Zealand, we feel that the paragraph as presented at the moment suggests that this convention only covers civilians and combatants and refers to customary law, but it leaves out the fact that there are other positive instruments that can protect individuals and therefore removes importance from them. So I think that the proposal that New Zealand just has covers that concern that we have. Thank you. Thank you, Argentina. The delegation of Iran.
I'm sorry, Madam President. Madam President, on preamble paragraph 5, to make it more consistent with the ICJ advisory opinion, as you read it out rightly, and with the Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations, I would like to suggest to add or threat of use of nuclear weapons after the use, because it is a fact that during last decades, nuclear weapons has been used twice, but for several times we have had the threat of use of nuclear weapons that has its own consequences, you know, very well. So this is the first suggestion that I would like to make. The second one is regarding to add a paragraph after 6 as 6 bis. The wording that I'm going to suggest has been gotten from resolutions of the General Assembly, which have been adopted in 1961, 1978, 1980, and 1981. It says that declaring after 6, we can have it as 6 bis, declaring also that the use of nuclear weapons is a crime against humanity, contrary to the spirit, letters, and aims of the United Nations, and should therefore be prohibited, pending the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. These are two suggestions that I wanted to make on this subsection. Thank you, Madam President.
Muchas gracias, Iran.
Thank you very much, Iran. Liechtenstein has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. On preamble paragraph 4, I was also going to propose a more comprehensive listing of the rules and principles under IHL, beginning after the term in the first line, international humanitarian law. I noted that the ambassador of New Zealand has also proposed a list of rules and principles, and I have not completely taken note of all of them, but for the sake of certainty, I would just repeat my proposal. I think it's the same as the one of New Zealand. I would include, after rules of international humanitarian law, in particular the rule of distinction, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the rule on proportionality in attack, prohibition on the use of weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, and the rules on the protection of the natural environment. This would cover the element on the natural environment that is already present in the preamble paragraph here, but would be more comprehensive, and that is very useful for the purpose of this preamble part of the convention or the treaty. In addition, we would have a preference to begin the paragraph with the word reaffirming. With regard to the other proposals put to the floor, we are certainly very supportive to have a more general reference to obligations under international law, and we would therefore very much support what has been proposed by the delegation of New Zealand with their first paragraph, the introductory paragraph to this humanitarian law subcluster. We're certainly also amenable to have a legally more appropriate formulation of the Martens Clause. I believe the proposal of New Zealand is a good one in that regard, and we would also support that one. Thank you.
Gracias, Liechtenstein. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Liechtenstein. The delegation of Cuba has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. With regard to PP4, like other delegations, we feel it's an important paragraph. It contains some very relevant items, but as it's worded at the moment, it's not a balanced paragraph. Let's not forget either that it's an incomplete text because, on the one hand, reference is made to a principle of international humanitarian law. Here, the principle relating to the limited capacities that states have to choose the means of warfare. But on the other hand, no reference is made to other principles of international humanitarian law, which in Cuba's opinion are also relevant in the context of nuclear weapons. So, Madam President, our preference would be to complete this paragraph by referring to these other principles. And we'd have to include, of course, the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants, the principle of proportionality, the need to avoid superfluous damage or unnecessary suffering. Another variant would be to not list all of the principles and find some other way of referring to this. My delegation could certainly be flexible as to how we find a compromise with regard to this paragraph. Then, with regard to PP5, I'd like to support the proposal made by the distinguished ambassador of Iran, namely to add to this paragraph an explicit reference to the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And finally, we also support the idea expressed by other delegations with the need to add a new paragraph to this subcluster through which we would reaffirm that all member states at all times must comply with the applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Thank you very much, Madam President. Thank you very much to the delegation of Cuba, the delegation of Switzerland, followed by Palestine, Sweden, Mozambique, Indonesia, and Austria, ICRC, Malaysia, Brazil, ICRC.
Madam President, with regard to PP4, we would see clear need to be more specific with regard to fundamental IHL principles, in particular regarding distinction, precaution and proportionality. And there we would like to support New Zealand's and Liechtenstein's proposal. However, one principle, I think one crucial principle is still missing, and we think we should add the principle that the right of the parties to an armed conflict to choose methods and means of warfare is not unlimited. With regard to PP5, if, as stated this morning, the preamble sets the foundation for the treaty by stating where we come from and where we want to go with this treaty, the paragraph requires further reflection and should be revisited. PP5 contains language which is not generally agreed and not commonly being used. And there I would like to open a parenthesis. We've heard it several times this afternoon, and we would like to support the principle that we should build our work here on consensus language. So turning back to PP5, there are different options for expressing the idea contained in the paragraph by staying in the realm of existing law. So state parties could, for instance, underline that any weapon that does not meet the requirements of IHL shall never be used, or express their concern that nuclear weapons could not be used in compliance with international humanitarian law. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you to Switzerland. I now give the floor to the State of Palestine.
It's going to be a short intervention because all the important things have been said. It is mainly to agree, especially after the intervention of New Zealand. This is an extremely easy intervention. We support an introductory paragraph of a more general nature. We agree with a more specific list of the main and key principles of IHL that are at stake, including, when we speak of the principle of distinction, its corollary of protection of civilians. This is also in line with the ICRC recommendations that we received on the draft. We also agree with the rephrasing of the Martens Clause that is closer to what we are used to. We also agree with adding the threat, not only the use of nuclear weapons, and we agree with an earlier suggestion by South Africa during the general comments on referring to the UN Charter and the calling on states to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of states. And we also agree with the last suggestions by Switzerland on the incompatibility of the use of nuclear weapons with IHL and the language. Well, we are flexible to look at language on the matter.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you to the delegation from the State of Palestine, and I'll give the floor to Sweden.
Proposals concerning PP4, but instead of presenting them, I would like to support the proposal made by New Zealand as well as Switzerland. On PP6, I would also like to support the proposal that was made by New Zealand. On PP5, we have the same concerns that was just expressed by my colleague from Switzerland. We feel that we are stepping a little bit ahead of things here. And so we would propose that we delete PP5, and instead I would like to propose the following paragraph as PP5, reading, noting that the use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, and in particular the principles and rules of humanitarian law. We feel that this would more accurately present the situation of international law and international and humanitarian law as it stands today. And we will present this, of course, in writing to you. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Suecia.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Sweden. Mozambique now, followed by Indonesia, Austria, ICRC, Malaysia.
Thank you, Madam President. My intervention will be very short, and it is in support of the distinguished ambassador of New Zealand, namely when she enumerates exhaustively the principles of IHL, and also in the clarification on the drafting of Martens Clause. We are ready to see the text in written form, but fundamentally we wanted to support that approach, which was also supported by many other delegations. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Mozambique. Indonesia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I'd like to echo and support what was mentioned by the distinguished ambassador of New Zealand, to have a clear and concise introductory paragraph related to international humanitarian law. In addition, we would also like to subscribe to the point made by the distinguished ambassador of Cuba, which states that we need to be balanced in terms of reflecting and naming all the international human rights elements and laws. I would leave that to you in terms of how you formulate that, but we would like to emphasize that there needs to be a balanced approach and a balanced reference to all existing international laws. Madam President, on Preamble Paragraph 5, we would like to support the additional language proposed by the distinguished ambassador of Iran, namely on the threat of use of nuclear weapons. On that same paragraph, we would like to replace the word would be contrary, and we would like to replace that with would constitute a grave breach. I repeat, would constitute a grave breach. We like to make reference on this language under Article 85.3b of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1, which states that launching an indiscriminate attack affecting the civilian population or civilian objects in the knowledge that such attack will cause excessive loss of life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects, as defined in Article 57, Paragraph 2, is a grave breach. So I would repeat again, the language replacing would be contrary, would constitute a grave breach, consistent with Article 85.3b of the 1977 Additional Protocol 1. The last point, Madam President, is I would also like to support the new paragraph proposed by Iran as reflected and as was mentioned to be incorporated under paragraph 6 bis. I thank you.
Muchas gracias a la
Thank you very much to the delegation of Indonesia. Austria now, followed by ICRC, Malaysia, Brazil, Venezuela, Egypt, Kazakhstan, and Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to be very short this time. We fully support all three proposals presented by New Zealand. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you. The International Committee of the Red Cross has the floor.
Well, thank you, Madam President. Well, we didn't speak earlier. I'd just like to start by acknowledging your efforts and certainly expressing our appreciation for the draft you've presented us with and the efforts of your team. We find that the draft convention provides a solid foundation for achieving the prohibition of nuclear weapons and advancing towards their eventual elimination. I just take the floor at this time to introduce the working paper that we've prepared for this meeting, Working Paper 7, which outlines the ICRC's views and recommendations on many of the key sections of the draft convention that we're discussing this morning. We had some earlier recommendations on Preamble Paragraph 1 about including and recognizing the difficulties in providing humanitarian assistance. Those have in many respects been dealt with earlier today, particularly by the proposal made by Austria. And I will come back later perhaps to discussing a new preambular paragraph on recognizing the increased risk of nuclear weapon use by accident, intent, or miscalculation. But focusing just a few brief comments on the paragraph we're discussing at the moment, preambular paragraph 4. Like others, we had some concerns about the way the preambular paragraph 4 is currently structured and wanted to see a fuller reflection of the relevant IHL rules included in that paragraph. We could, in this regard, very much support the proposal which was made by New Zealand, and I think the way they've structured it and the substance they've put in their proposal addresses our concerns. Similarly, the proposal made for preambular paragraph 6 with regard to the Martin Clause, I think addresses our concerns and questions that we had about the ambiguity of of the phrase "in cases not covered by this convention." The simpler and more direct structure and formulation proposed by New Zealand, we think is clearer and would address the questions and the ambiguities that we raised in our document. So, thank you.
Muchas gracias al comité.
Thank you very much to the ICRC. Malaysia has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Just on PP4 and PP5, we would just like to echo delegations who have spoken before us on supporting the constructive proposals that have been made on this, and we would like to look at that further. On PP6, we just wish to restate again what we've mentioned this morning, that we are seeking clarification on the intent and need for this paragraph, as it refers to cases not covered under this convention, presumably cases not related to nuclear weapons. Then there's a question of the relevance and need of this. In emphasizing cases not covered by this convention, and then speaking of essentially international law principles applicable to civilians and combatant, in its second half suggests that the intent of the PP is to reinforce international humanitarian law. However, as international humanitarian law only applies to armed conflict, and the only possible cases covered in the convention where armed conflict would occur is with regard to use in Article 1, then we wish to therefore seek views from other delegations whether this language could be considered further. And we thank the delegation of New Zealand for pointing out a constructive way forward in this regard. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Malaysia, Brazil now, followed by Venezuela, Egypt and Kazakhstan.
Thank you, President. We wish also to support paragraphs by New Zealand, which we think solve many of the issues that were identified by several delegations, and makes for more complete reference to the applicable international humanitarian law. So we fully support that as an alternative. We would also like to support proposals by Iran on to include threat of use, and also its PP6 bis, declaring use of nuclear weapons a crime against humanity. We would also wish to support Indonesia's proposal to make a reference to a grave breach of international law, which I think it's a step up from what is currently drafted. We would also like to indicate and make it clear that we think that the Swedish proposal that draws upon language from the International Court of Justice advisory opinion is not helpful, because here we're trying to move forward, not remain within the status quo. So we wish to really fill the gap, and the gap requires us to declare and to be clearer than that advisory opinion was at the time in 1996. We wish now to be clear as to what we understand to be a grave breach of international law, the use of nuclear weapons. So we do not support the Swedish language. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you to Brazil. Venezuela has the floor now, followed by Egypt. Thank you, Madam President. We'd also like to join in the support of those to support those delegations that themselves have supported new paragraphs introduced by New Zealand. We feel that the consensus language from the NPT document is a good solution to the concerns that delegations have expressed, and we would include ourselves in those delegations. And then we feel that the principles of international law, that paragraph, is not a very balanced paragraph, PP4 then, not very balanced. And also, our delegation would like to support the proposal made by Iran to include an explicit reference to the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. And we also support PP6 bis, that proposal that was also brought in by Iran. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Venezuela. Egypt now, followed by Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Mexico, and Thailand.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Just a quick reference that we would like to express support to the distinguished delegation of Iran's suggestion and PP5 to the addition of use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. We would also support the suggestion provided by the delegation of Indonesia as well to change the phrase from would be contrary to constitute a grave breach. I think that is a helpful suggestion as well. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Egipto.
Thank you, Egypt. Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Madam President. On PP5, we believe that any use of nuclear weapons is contrary not just to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, but is definitely in contravention of the very spirit of UN Charter, and is also a violation of international law, in particular international humanitarian law. So we would like to propose to broaden and strengthen the paragraph with the following wording. We reaffirm that any use of nuclear weapons will be in contravention of the spirit of the Charter of the United Nations and will be a violation of international law, in particular international humanitarian law, and also reiterate that nuclear weapons pose a serious threat to the very survival of humankind. We will submit our proposal in written form to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the delegation of Kazakhstan. Nigeria has the floor.
Mexico.
Followed by Mexico, Thailand, and Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Just a quick one, just to say that we fully support the proposals made by our neighbor, New Zealand, and to also put on record that the proposal by Iran to include the threat of use is in order, and we are fully in support of that. I thank you.
Muchas gracias, Nigeria.
Thank you, Nigeria. Mexico.
Muchas gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd also like to join in the support for the New Zealand paragraph in this section. Also in PP4, I'd like to support the New Zealand and Liechtenstein proposal with regard to humanitarian law, and also New Zealand's paragraph for PP6 I support. Thank you.
Es Mexico.
Thank you, Mexico. Thailand has the floor, followed by Iran.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thailand welcomes the New Zealand's approach, which appropriately reflects IHR here in the instrument, and we also would like to support the Iranian proposal to include clearly the threat of use. Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Regarding the suggestion made by the distinguished representative of Indonesia, supported by Brazil and Egypt, and with some modification by Kazakhstan, I would like to support all these suggestions and say that, in fact, we need to strengthen and promote the ICJ advisory opinion. We are not here just to repeat the agreed languages. And these are very good modifications suggested by these distinguished delegations, and I would support that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Irán.
Thank you, Iran. Delegation of Ghana has the floor, and I don't see any other delegations asking for the floor on this subcluster of paragraphs. Oh, the ICRC has also just asked for the floor. Delegation of Ghana.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This is just a quick intervention, generally to express support for the proposal by the delegation of New Zealand, which generally provides a complete reference to IHL. Madam President, regarding PP6, we also like to support the proposal by Iran, as echoed by other delegations, that the threat of use of force is in the right sense and should be included in the PP6. Thank you.
I thank Ghana. The ICRC now.
Thank you, Madam President. I don't wish to prolong the session. I just wanted to make a comment in response to the proposals made and supported by several delegations about referring to the concept of grave breach, and in particular the link to Article 85, Paragraph 3 of Additional Protocol 1. I just wanted to point out that one of the implications of that approach is that the grave breach concept and the way it's outlined in Additional Protocol 1 is very much linked to international armed conflicts, and that one of the consequences of this approach would be limiting to those kind of conflicts and perhaps be a bit limiting, given that non-international armed conflicts would be excluded from that kind of language. So it may have the unintended consequence of excluding non-international armed conflicts from classifying the use of nuclear weapons in that regard as a grave breach. So, thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. The delegation of Costa Rica now, followed by Algeria. Thank you, Madam President. Very briefly, we'd just like to support the proposal made by New Zealand to include a PP in this cluster, an introductory paragraph in this cluster, and also the proposal of Liechtenstein and New Zealand with regard to including the principles of international humanitarian law. Thank you. Thank you, Costa Rica. Algeria has the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Likewise, I would like just to support the inclusion of the wording of threat of use, and as well as the language of ICG. It should be reinforced as well in these paragraphs. Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Algeria. There are no more delegations asking for the floor. Yes, there are. The delegation of Ecuador. Thank you very much, Madam President. I'm sorry to keep taking the floor again. There's only me in the delegation. I do keep sending my paragraphs to the Secretariat. PP5, the threat of use of force. I'm not going to go through the arguments, and there are a lot of them, why it's important to include this aspect of the threat of the use, but I would just like to express the support of my delegation for this proposal. It's an important concept. It's a fundamental concept within our draft convention. Thank you, Madam President. That was it. Thank you very much to all delegations. Again, very effectively and in an interactive way, we've been able to read through the 3 paragraphs that refer to the legal instrument and international humanitarian law, basically. We also have a proposal outstanding from New Zealand, a paragraph that they're going to let us have fairly soon. And we've also taken note of the other comments that have been made, suggested amendments from delegations. So, with that request for paragraphs for proposed language to be please sent to us by email, nuclear.conference@un.org is the address.
nuclear.conference@un.org. And please copy to Spies M, Michael Spies, SPIESM @un.org. I repeat, SPIESM @un.org. So that we can move on to review the next subgroup of articles that deal with the relationship of this instrument with disarmament and the overall disarmament architecture. Como vamos de nuevo entonces a hacer una consideración.
So, let's now move on to comprehensive consideration of these paragraphs. I'd like to give an introduction to each of these articles so that we can then open the floor for delegations to make their comments. Above all, with regard to PP7, this reflects the numerous proposals for the preamble to reaffirm the basic principles of the Charter of the United Nations. The language used in this paragraph is based on identical wording that you find in the preamble to the Conventions on Biological Weapons and the Convention on Chemical Weapons. With regard to paragraph 8, this language is based on the preamble from 71258, and this attempts to reflect the vision that this convention should make a contribution towards the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Paragraph 9 is linked to the previous one, stating that the states parties, when they sign, are committed to working towards this goal. Paragraphs 9 and 10 reflect these calls that have been made at the conference to include language that reflects the need for further effective measures to be taken that will lead to disarmament. Recognizing that the general obligations under the Convention will constitute measures that will be taken with partial impact to achieve the general goal of disarmament. Paragraph 9 also says refers to what the general final process should be for the disarmament process. And we took as our guide for wording this paragraph the actual NPT treaty itself, which in its preamble expresses the desire to facilitate the a cessation on the production of nuclear weapons, the destruction of all existing arsenals, and the elimination of nuclear weapons from national arsenals as well as their means of delivery. Paragraph 11 also reflects the many interventions made with regard to general and complete disarmament. That was addressed at the first special session of the General Assembly, dedicated to disarmament, and that this is the ultimate goal of the United Nations in the area of disarmament. The language is based on the first preambular paragraphs of the conventions prohibiting chemical weapons as well as the one prohibiting chemical weapons, biological and chemical weapons. And general and complete disarmament is also an element from Article 6 of the NPT, and it appears also in the preamble to the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Treaty for a World Free of Nuclear Weapons. Finally, in paragraph 12, we also have, this reflects the requests and calls of member states for the preamble to reflect, include a reference to the International Court of Justice, which states that the goal of nuclear disarmament is an obligation under international law. The language in the paragraph uses this language in the form of an affirmation of the member states that are party to this convention. So now I'd like to open the floor so that delegations can refer to the paragraph related to the UN Charter and then the paragraphs that relate to the current disarmament architecture. Chile, State of Palestine, South Africa, Cuba, Argentina, Guatemala have asked for the floor, and the list continues. The delegation of Chile has the floor. Thank you very much, Madam President. Since it's the first time that we've taken the floor, we'd like to congratulate you on how you're conducting our work. I'm going to make my intervention in English.
The floor on PP 11 on behalf of the following member states: Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Jamaica, Indonesia, Philippines, Uruguay, Venezuela, Guatemala, and Peru, and my own country, Chile. General and complete disarmament, commonly referred to as GCD, and humanitarian disarmament share a common and rich history. humanitarian motives were at the core of campaigns for general disarmament arising from the indiscriminate slaughter of World War I and World War II. Since the GCD has been placed at the heart of the system for collective maintenance of international peace and security embodied in the United Nations Charter. It is thus not surprised that major multilateral disarmament treaties describe themselves in their preamble as steps towards the ultimate goal of GCD. Indeed, GCD is embedded in half a dozen treaties, including the Bangkok Treaty, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the Pelindaba Treaty, the Seabed Treaty, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, and the Treaty of Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone in Central Asia. The Nuclear Ban Treaty will contribute to making significant progress towards nuclear disarmament. It will also considerably reinforce the existing broader disarmament architecture. As such, the Ban Treaty should not be viewed as an end in itself, but as a critical piece of a wider web of treaties that jointly advance humanitarian disarmament and GCD. We therefore welcome the inclusion of a preambular clause on GCD in the draft treaty, which reads, quote, determined also to act with a view to achieving effective progress toward general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control, end of quote. And we call for it to remain as it is. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Muchas gracias a la delegación de Chile. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you, Chile, the State of Palestine, followed by South Africa, Cuba, and Argentina.
Thank you, Madam President. We commend the effort to articulate the different obligations and objectives that stand around this convention, including other relevant instruments and the general objective of nuclear disarmament and disarmament. Just a language suggestion for the PP that reads, bearing in mind that the prohibition of nuclear weapons would be an important contribution towards comprehensive nuclear disarmament. We would suggest replacing bearing in mind by stressing, and replacing would be by constitutes an important contribution towards comprehensive nuclear disarmament. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Tiene la palabra.
Thank you very much. South Africa.
Thanks, Madam President. We really appreciate that you included in the preamble the reference to the United Nations Charter in PP7. However, we have a proposal, the last one from our side under this cluster, as an entry point to PP7, currently determined to contribute to the realization of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We would like to propose a paragraph which has some very important elements that we wish should be reflected under this treaty. The proposal could be before PP7. Other than that, we are open to as Madam President wishes. The proposal is recalling that in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations, states must refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, and that the establishment and the maintenance of international peace and security are to be promoted with the least diversion of armaments of the world's human and economic resources. End of quote. We will send the proposal to the given emails we feel that this has some important elements that we wish to see reflected in the preamble part. Thanks, Madam President.
Muchas gracias, Sudáfrica.
Thank you very much, South Africa, Cuba, followed by Argentina, Guatemala, and the Philippines. Thank you very much, Madam President. The Cuban delegation has several draft amendments for this subcluster. Some proposals are to change the current language, but there are a couple of new paragraphs which I'd like to just introduce in one go, so I don't have to take the floor again, if I may. Well, first of all, I'd like to support the proposal just made by the distinguished colleague from South Africa. Of course, we'll have to await the language to go carefully through it, but it seems that it's a timely, appropriate proposal, and that can be supported by Cuba. And then after current PP7, I'd like us to include two new paragraphs that I'll read out in English. We feel that PP7 quite rightly introduces the role of the United Nations, but we also feel that it's important to certainly include some references of precedents, key precedents of the historic role that the General Assembly has had when it comes to nuclear disarmament. And so I'd like to read out in English the two new paragraphs that we are proposing. The first would read as follows.
Recalling its first resolution adopted on January 24, 1946, and subsequent resolutions which call for the elimination of nuclear weapons. That could be the first additional new paragraph, and then immediately after that, the following additional new paragraph. Recalling also the final document of its first special session devoted to disarmament, which emphasizes that nuclear weapons pose the greatest danger to mankind and to the survival of civilization, and calls for the complete elimination of such weapons. En lo que tiene que ver con el párrafo preambular 8.
Then with regard to PP8, we could accept the paragraph as it is. However, in order to try to strengthen the language, I'd like to make a slight suggestion, which would be to add in the first line, before the word prohibition, the sentence or the phrase legally binding. The paragraph would read, as I propose,
that the legally binding prohibition of nuclear weapons would be an important contribution towards comprehensive nuclear disarmament. Preambular 9.
PP9. We suggest adding in the second line, after the word facilitate, the following three words: irreversible, verifiable, and transparent. The paragraph overall, as amended, would read in English.
Stressing the urgent need to achieve further effective measures of nuclear disarmament in order to facilitate the irreversible, verifiable, and transparent elimination from national arsenals of nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery. Por último,
Finally, PP12, which has to do with the International Court of Justice. Rather than the word affirming, we'd like to change that for reaffirming. We propose this because, as you know, the General Assembly makes this affirmation every year in its annual resolution on the follow-up of the advisory opinion of the Court. And so this is affirmed every year by the General Assembly, so this is a reaffirmation. And I think that that is simply an amendment that reflects reality. And we'd like to add at the end of this paragraph the following sentence that I'll read out in English.
As unanimously concluded by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of July 8, 1996, on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and also affirming that the obligation is universal and unconditional. Voy a leer el párrafo en su conjunto.
I'll read out the sentence as a whole, as amended.
Reaffirming that there exists an obligation to pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control, as unanimously concluded by the ICJ in its advisory opinion of July 8, 1996, on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, and also affirming that the obligation is universal and unconditional. Con relación a la última parte de nuestra...
With regard to the last part of our proposal, I'd just like to explain that we feel that it's important to point out that this isn't just an obligation for the state parties or future state parties to the Convention. It will also be an obligation on those countries that are not a future party to the Convention. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a la distinguida delegación de Cuba.
Thank you very much to the distinguished delegation of Cuba, the delegation of Argentina, followed by Guatemala, Philippines, and Egypt. Thank you, Madam President. With regard to this paragraph, Argentina feels that we shouldn't ratify a legal vacuum when it comes to prohibition. NPT Article 6 calls for total disarmament, and that should be read as the prohibition of nuclear weapons. That's why we agree with the proposal from the State of Palestine, and we don't have a particular preference, but we could perhaps change would be for is, but constitutes would also be fine for us. And then in that same PP8, we'd like to suggest two new paragraphs. PP8 bis.
The fact that the risk of a nuclear weapons use with their unacceptable consequences can only be avoided when all nuclear weapons have been eliminated. Y PP8 ter.
And PP8 ter.
Set forth in Article 6 of the NPT Treaty. Respecto a los párrafos
with regard to PPs 9, 10, 11, and 12, Argentina believes that in Article 1 we should include the elimination of nuclear weapons to justify these paragraphs. So we agree with the wording of those paragraphs on the condition that when we come on to talk about Article 1, general obligations, we make an amendment there. With regard to paragraph 13, given the links to the TBT and the NPT, we're taking as the basis the proposal that you put forward in the draft, but given that this new instrument is linked to these other instruments, this is key, and perhaps, therefore, we could split this paragraph into three. So we'd begin by reaffirming the crucial importance of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and then after that, stressing the vital importance of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and finally, affirming the contribution of the treaties establishing nuclear weapons-free zones. I think that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much to the delegation of Argentina. Well, actually, Article 13 wasn't included in this subcluster because it's a whole discussion in itself, namely the relationship of this instrument with the other existing instruments, the NPT as well as the CNTBT and the other instruments that are relevant in this area. So we are going to give specific consideration to that article later. Guatemala, followed by the Philippines. Thank you, Madam President. Since it's the first time I'm taking the floor, I'd like to congratulate you on your praiseworthy work conducting such important negotiations. Rest assured that Guatemala will continue to play an active and constructive role to ensure that we can reach agreement on such an important instrument. We're grateful for the draft text that you've shared with us. We feel it's an excellent basis for negotiations. I'd now like to refer to the preamble of the draft. In general, we're very happy with it. It refers to the majority of principles and concepts that we feel are indispensable to be included in the Convention. As the draft is worded, it follows a humanitarian approach by making a reference to the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and the unacceptable nature that the use represents for humanity. However, we feel some changes could be made in this section as follows. With regard to PP8, first of all, in this PP, we should recognize, as experience with conventions has shown us, with regard to mass destruction and indiscriminate use, the complete destruction of nuclear weapons is necessary for their elimination and important for them to become delegitimized. So in that respect, we would say in English
that the prohibition of nuclear weapons will be an important contribution towards comprehensive nuclear disarmament. Debe hacer más explícita.
We need to make this requirement more explicit. We would propose the following in English.
Bearing in mind that the prohibition of nuclear weapons is necessary to achieve nuclear disarmament. Adicionalmente, señora.
Additionally, Madam President, my delegation wouldn't have any difficulty in supporting Cuba's proposal on including a paragraph on the first resolution of the General Assembly. Thank you.
Le doy las gracias a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Guatemala. I see that we're approaching 6 o'clock now. So we'll take Philippines. They're next on the list. I'd also like to tell you that on the list of requests to take the floor, we have Philippines, Egypt, Mozambique, Indonesia, New Zealand, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Ecuador, Brazil, State of Palestine, Sweden, Thailand, and Iran. So I give you that list so that you can be prepared to speak first thing in the morning. Do we agree? And I did want to inform you that the Future of Life Institute, an organization that we're familiar with, has prepared a very interesting video with messages from scientists and Nobel Peace Prize winners from the fields of science, which is relevant for the work of this conference. It's a message for all of us, and we'll be able to project it tomorrow so that we can hear what those messages are from outside the room and the effect it can have on our work. the delegation of Cuba. You requested the floor. Thank you, Madam President. I'm sorry for asking for the floor at this late hour, but with regard to how we're going to proceed, I just wanted to make a brief comment. Today, as you said, we've had a very productive day with very many proposals. Certainly for my delegation, it's been difficult to follow up on each of the proposals made. We're sure that at the end of each cluster, you're going to produce a compilation so that we can see in one single document what all of the draft amendments are. I just wanted to ask whether technically, additionally to that compilation, it would be possible for you to provide a screen here in the room where in real time we can see the proposals that delegations are making. I think this really would help us to have a good interaction, because once you can see the various amendments being made, sometimes, in some cases anyway, you might arrive at the conclusion that another proposal is better than your own. So you don't need to insist on your own proposal, or you can perhaps see on the screen where you can strike a compromise. It's a technical question. I don't know whether it's technically possible, but if it is, it would be very useful, I think, and would help delegations to follow the discussion in real time.
Le agradezco a la delegación.
I thank the delegation of Cuba. I wanted to say that, yes, we're taking on board not just the specific comments in a very detailed way, but we're also waiting to receive the text proposals. There's a group of countries that made various text proposals that we discussed, other delegations discussed, and I asked them before they give us those text proposals if they could discuss the proposal amongst themselves so that they could produce a convergent proposal. So I'd like to thank all delegations for the very constructive negotiations. But there are proposals, for example, from South Africa, Ecuador, Austria, Sweden, Cuba as well, that have been commented on by other delegations, and it's important that we receive those texts to include them in the observations made. With regard to the issue that was raised with regard to having a screen, I think our experience has shown us that the collective drafting exercise is not something that we can engage in at the moment, at this stage, given the limited amount of time that we have. So certainly we'll always be available to work closely with you, with delegations, to produce the revised versions of the texts that we can read in the room. But I think it will be a little more difficult to have a screen that would be more a collective drafting exercise. I think that would slow us down rather than speed us up, and I think we have been quite productive. I thank you very much for your cooperation, and of course the whole team is available to all delegations to be able to give you a summary or a recap of everything that's been said during the meetings today. Very well, so we'll meet tomorrow. Thank you very much for your constructive participation today. The meeting stands adjourned.
¿Tiene un punto de orden?
Oh, there's a point of order. Distinguished delegate, is it a point of order? No? The meeting is adjourned.